Good afternoon. My name is Jana Robinson, and I am Space Security Program Director at the Prague Security Studies Institute. I'm delighted to moderate this panel because of the topic, as well as the distinguished speakers who each have valuable and first-hand experience with regard to allied and international space cooperation and partnerships. As this panel indicates, we are persuaded that a new competitive dynamic exists with regard to space partnerships that has significant implications for the space security portfolio. And this, I believe, has been confirmed by a number of speakers today. We've already heard a good deal about a worrying spectrum of threats that are less overt, if not under the radar, designed by our rivals to achieve strategic gains without triggering a meaningful reaction or response, military or political. Counterspace measures conducted via the cyber domain represent a prime example of adversaries seeking to secure an asymmetric advantage without paying a serious price. Economic and financial transactions relevant to space security are probably the least understood area of new hybrid space operations. In April 2018, Xinhua Media stated that China had signed 121 space cooperation agreements with 37 countries and 4 international organizations. The State Council Information Office's 2016 white paper on China's space activities, released in January 2017, stated that China had signed 43 space cooperation agreements with 29 countries, space agencies, and international organizations. If accurate, this would mean an increase of 78 international cooperation agreements over some 15 months. Our latest research at PSSI has targeted this particular challenge and focused on China and Russia, the only non-democratic countries that have global economic and financial space footprints. In short, we wanted to build a more complete picture via our data of the competitive situation on the ground in the space sector. We have observed, through tracking and visually mapping of the global transactions of their state-owned or state-controlled enterprises, that often package deals concluded by China and Russia with various countries potentially expose them to the risk and vulnerability of unequal and unsustainable space partnerships. Space actors or aspirants with weak economies and underdeveloped democratic institutions are especially susceptible to being captured by vertically integrated control of their space sectors by these external actors, something we term space sector capture. As Roger described earlier in his introductory remarks, China and Russia, for example, will provide 1 or more satellites, launch services, launch insurance, the construction of ground stations, the provision of operating personnel, 100% subsidized financing, their services, such as those from their GNSS systems, and so on. The net effect of which is to create a sole source supply relationship and perilous level of dependency. As of March 31 of this year, we have identified 216 transactions involving these two countries, meaning China and Russia, in 88 countries. China accounted for 105 of these transactions and Russia for 94. There were 5 additional joint China-Russia transactions. The executive summary of this 120-page report is now available, and you're welcome to pick up a copy in the back of the room at the end of this panel. In this context, I wish to recognize the German Space Agency Space Situational Awareness Department for supporting this research financially. This document basically introduces a new risk category associated with the space security policy portfolio, namely economic and financial risks related to non-democratic international space partnerships. What we found is a global competition for space partnerships which we believe the allies have not sufficiently focused on. Among other benefits, China and Russia are actively pursuing their model of international space partnerships globally to increase their influence in the space domain and multilateral fora and shape behavioral norms and other elements of space activities. This is despite the fact that economic and financial incentives provided, often at non-market terms, build problematic long-term dependencies for the recipient countries. We should understand better and carefully monitor this new risk category, as it will also help us appreciate the asymmetric threat to global space norms and standards stemming from these lopsided arrangements. Accordingly, I believe this panel is very timely and an ideal occasion to take stock of allied space partnerships and areas that those represented here can address jointly. With this, I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. Their full bios, of course, are available in your brochures. So first, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Regina Pelzes, Senior Policy Officer at the German Aerospace Center's Department of Space Situational Awareness. We will also hear from Dr. John Stouffer, Principal Assistant to the Secretary of the United States Air Force for Space. I'm also delighted to have with us Dr. Ajay Lela, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi. Last but not least, we are pleased to have Eric Desotels, Director of the Office of Emerging Security Challenges at the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification and Compliance at the U.S. Department of State. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to productive exchange. I'd like to now give floor to Regina for brief introductory remarks.
Thank you so much, Jana, for the introduction and also for the invite to be. It's a pleasure to be in this panel, and it's also been a pleasure to follow the work and support the work that you've been doing for this particular executive summary and the report, also in the wider context of your engagement in space sector capture research. So in our discussion today, also in view of the composition of our panel, I was asked to provide some European perspective, which is of course informed by the German Space Agency's bilateral and multilateral engagement that we have with different partners. And I would like to bring one particular aspect to the debate, which has already been touched upon in some of the panels today by my European colleagues, which is, if we look at collaboration and competition, is the aspect of complementarity. So in a similar sense that conflict lines today are blurred and we have asymmetric lines of engagement, we can also understand the notion of competition and collaboration as something that's a gray area rather than something completely clear-cut. So it's a dichotomy rather than two complete distinctions. So essentially we can see those two ideas on opposite ends of a spectrum with many different options in between that we can use for our different engagements and our different partnerships. So for instance, we've seen in the history of spaceflight that former rivals can become partners in pursuing some endeavors for certain reasons. We can think, of course, in this context of the International Space Station as one of the largest peaceful projects of this kind, but since we're in a security community here and we have a vantage point on RPO, we could, of course, also recall the Apollo-Soyuz test project 1975, which was essentially a high-profile, mutually transparent rendezvous and proximity operations where two rivals decided to merge and plug together their systems to mark an occasion of detente in their relationship. We can today also, of course, think about private actors and private operators of satellites who are competitors or competing entities, but yet they seek collaborative channels and transparency by, for instance, exchanging information on maneuvering in order to foster their jointly shared goal of maintaining a safe operating environment for themselves. So in that sense, what I would like to say is that even while you compete, you may choose to collaborate to some extent at the same time, because you either make it an end in itself for its own sake, or because you set up collaborations as a means to foster a shared goal and to arrive and enhance your shared interests with your counterparts. And I believe that Europe can serve as a very useful example of trying to negotiate on this spectrum of competition and complementarity and collaboration. Both within Europe as different actors that have to reconcile their interests, but also Europe as a whole as an actor in the global context. So as individual member states and actors in Europe, we have been collaborating since the 1960s, of course, on the one hand, in intergovernmental organizations such as the European Space Agency, but increasingly, and especially for critical infrastructure projects, and that are the remit of our engagement, also very much in supranational context and the umbrella of the European Union and the European Commission, particularly in the areas of PNT, Earth observation, SSA. So the different actors in Europe, and I mean both individual member states, but also jointly as aggregated entities such as ESA and the EU, we understand that we cannot act alone due to political, budgetary, or technological reasons. And hence we have learned to constantly identify common shared goals that we can pursue together and develop the requisite means and instruments for these types of collaboration on the political and the operational side. However, since we have a variety of actors, as Tanya already mentioned earlier, and we have diverse legacies and heritages in the different capabilities that we have developed in the past decades, our collaboration always includes some kind of competitive element within the collaboration that may be refreshing in some instances, but it's also something that we need to negotiate and reconcile in order to move on and foster the interests that we share. So in consequence, this means that we often have to step back from some capabilities or de-emphasize some capability areas that some of us are doing, whereas we can step up in some other areas. So we have this process of maintaining a kind of equilibrium by specializing and emphasizing certain areas for each of us, because none of us can do everything by ourselves, otherwise that would lead to duplication and inertia in the end. So we specialize. If we take this within Europe and we look at the global scale and look at Europe as an actor in that domain, it is clear to the different various actors in Europe that we cannot act by ourselves. We brought up the idea of strategic autonomy today in your introduction, but also earlier in the panels it came up. And for us, I think we all understand this, that in order to contribute to burden sharing globally, we all need requisite means in order to contribute effectively. So we do need to enhance some of our capabilities in these areas to really enhance and augment and offer redundancy or resilience or backups or complementary sources of data, of capabilities to our trusted partners. And that would be it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. If I may, I will leave the questions for after everybody's remarks. So, John, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jana, and I'd like to thank you and your organization and all the supporters for hosting this. It's the first time I've been here, and I can tell you it's really an extraordinary event, and I think you all are participating in something that we've really got a lot of work to do on. I guess I'd like to start with a disclaimer that I am not a policy person, so all the policy questions will go down to Eric from the State Department to answer. But what I wanted to do is focus on what the Air Force is doing in terms of partnerships. And so with that, I would start with our new administration, the Trump administration, shortly after they took office. They published the National Defense Strategy, and it had 3 important lines of effort in it. One was to improve the readiness and lethality of the forces. The second was to really restore better business practices, so more efficiency into how we buy things. But the third one, which is what I'll speak to, is it's strengthening alliances and attracting new partners. And I think it's really important to notice that of the three things that the defense strategy has stated, the partnerships is one of them. So I'd like to break it down into a number of items that the Air Force has been doing to help this along. The first is in the area of security policy. So one of the main barriers for us working with partners and alliances is that we restrict ourselves through security classification. And there's two things that the secretary at the time, who just recently left us, started. There's the two actions. The first one we call yes foreign, okay, which is kind of an affectionate way to address a caveat that we apply within the security classifications called no foreign, which means you cannot share it with a foreign national. Now it turns out that the origins of no foreign were in the intelligence community. And when you look back at the very specific reasons to use no foreign, it has to do with things that today people don't even understand. They just slap it on because it's easier to just default to something that you won't get in trouble with than try to figure out exactly whether or not it shouldn't be shared. So in her memo that she signed out to the Air Force, there were a couple things to do. One was to really restore and eliminate back to the purpose of no foreign, with the intent of actually not over restricting what we can share with our foreign partners. The second thing had to do with the facilities and systems that we build that we want to start using with our partners. Okay, so from the beginning, when a system or a facility is designed, it should be done with the intent to share information. So a typical thing would be not defaulting to the most sensitive IT systems that carry that information, so that you can easily bring in our partners to work on whatever the work has to be done. So the second thing she did in this area was a classification policy review, and that had a couple parts to it. There's, first of all, for whatever reason, we have really compartmented our programs in space, and it no longer matches the era that we're in. We are talking about contested domains, and we, in many cases, are not prohibited from using certain language that you would think would be obvious to be able to discuss. So the first thing is to reduce the number of compartments that we have, and the second thing is to actually downgrade. So an example of a downgrade would be something that we might not acknowledge, we finally can start to acknowledge. And that is a huge change, so that we can start working with our partners to actually develop the policies and the norms of behavior and all of that. So those are kind of a couple things in the area of security policy that is really a barrier to developing new partners, and we're really trying to change that. The second topic is, I would call, in the area of capabilities and interoperability. One of the big changes that the Air Force did was to its main acquisition organization called the Space and Missile Systems Center. We've called it SMC 2.0, and there's a series of restructuring of responsibilities and roles in that. But the one I would highlight is a position that was created specifically to do outreach and partnerships. And we're trying to bring in new ways of working with other customers, both international, commercial, and the like. So we're really trying to change kind of how we approach building the capabilities. There are many other things in terms of capabilities that we do. We have a lot of cooperative agreements to do research and technology together. We're signing more and more as time goes on. We're trying to build our architectures in an integrated and interoperable way, and that can include whether a country builds something on their own but it's designed to complement, or whether they actually buy into part of our architecture or vice versa. Another item is hosted payloads. We're starting to do more and more of that. And in each of these things, we are deepening the relationship and the reliance on each other to strengthen the partnership, strengthen the alliances, and also build new partnerships. The next one is in operations, which technically is not an Air Force responsibility the way we've organized. Many Americans don't know this, but the Air Force doesn't conduct warfare. That's the combatant command. And so within what was Strategic Command, who own the responsibility for space, which is now transitioning to a new command called Space Command, there's a new center called the Combined Space Operations Center. It has now got international people in it, and that's something that we've been very proud of. I think the partnerships are growing, and it's one that I think demonstrates our commitment to strengthen those alliances. The last item is training. There's a couple things we've done to expand training, which really provides some of the foundational relationship building, and that is in terms of courses that we offer, an increasing number of international partners, so that's Space 100, 200, and 300. There's also a war game that we've done that it's an expanding partnership with international partners, and that's called the Schriever War Games. So I guess the question is, how are we doing on all of this? And I will tell you, when the Secretary first signed out these actions and we've been pushing on them, it turns out that people tended to kind of look at what they were doing and do more of it, particularly with the partners that we were very comfortable with. But when it comes to being one of 3 things in our national defense strategy, that's not good enough. So the Secretary really tried to drive this to new and different, kind of really an expanded way. And what she would point to is that when the U.S. goes to war, we don't like it to be fair, so we try to build a coalition. And in the last recent number of years, we've done that at least twice. One was to expel Iraq from Kuwait, and the other was against ISIS. And each of those times we had between 50 and 75 countries participating. Now, some of those countries really didn't have any warfighting capabilities. They sent cooks, or they sent medical people. And the message, though, was that we're standing together. And that's the most important thing, and that's why one of the 3 lines of efforts is to enhance our relationships with international partners, because together we're stronger, and that's the bottom line. But as a final note, I would say, unlike the coalitions that we put together in the past, we can't wait for the crisis to occur. This is something that we need to do well in advance, so we are standing together before a crisis occurs. So those are the things that we in the Air Force are doing to strengthen our partnerships, and that's all for my remarks.
Thank you, John, for your excellent observation concerning what the U.S. Air Force is doing in this regard. Ajay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first thank the organizers, particularly the chair, for inviting me over here. We had a very interesting discussion since morning. We are coming at fag end of the day. So I thought, let me start slightly on a lighter note. Usually I've been asked that, is there India in a space race? I think India has already lost the so-called space race, because none of you even made a mention to India's ASAT since morning. Well, having said that, I'm supposed to look at a cooperation as well as a conflict as far as the entire space domain is concerned. To start with, there was a talk in the earlier sessions that we should not have a certain amount of a comparison with nuclear issues when you're talking of a space issues. I entirely agree with that. The second issue which comes up is that there has been always a talk of space, laws of the sea and maritime issues also to understand the space domain. So I think essentially what lacks, which very few people are actually ready to agree, that there is no theoretical postulation as far as space is concerned. People are saying that there is no Mahan as far as space is concerned, and that could be one of the reasons why there is certain amount of a differences of opinion into different type of a people, why we look at space differently. I think when we look at a space, it all started with 57. Again, there was a nuclear element associated with it because the first satellite which was launched by the erstwhile USSR, there was an opinion that it is essentially to demonstrate the ICBM capabilities. Subsequently, you all know the history. You had a Gagarin movement which was responded by Apollo program. So essentially, space began its journey as a process of a competition, not of a process of a collaboration. But now let's come to the present tense. We got an International Space Station. You got issues like engines like RD-180, which has been sold by Russia to the US. So I think we have completed a full circle where it started as a entirely agenda of a competition. There is a certain amount of a collaboration also is being seen over here. So I'm not getting into the global details of it. What I will do is that I'll concentrate more onto the Indian aspects of it, a sort of an Indian case study. So if you really look at India's space program, India got independence in 47. India's space program could be said to have begun around early 60s period. Essentially, if I'm looking at Indian space program, and I'm not looking at it as an Indian, but I still find that is a very unique case for discussion and debate. Because as far as this space program is concerned, there were three elements which were beneficial as well as a sufferer for the space program. The first and foremost element is that India started space program as a global collaboration space program. We had USSR, we had Russia, we had USSR, we had France, we had USA. Everybody was collaborating with Russia when India started the program with sounding rockets. But then India went nuclear, and there was a period of so-called technological apartheid as far as India was concerned. And trust you me, this period was almost for 4 decades or so. So essentially, into the existential life of India's space program of 5 decades, we were under the technological apartheid for almost 4 decades. Then Indo-US nuclear deal happened, and things have become slightly easier. So this is one way one has to look at India's space program. When there was no collaboration, there was no competition also, but a country was in a form of isolation. But at the same time, if you really look at overall journey of India's space program, I still feel that in spite of all these limitations, it is more of a collaborative journey. As I was making a mention that there was an assistance which was given by major players who were making great inroads in that point in time. Particularly with particularly with European Union, India has got one of the best arrangements which have been going on. States like Germany, states like France particularly, India has one of the best arrangements which have been going on for quite some years. With US also, things have started easing out, and in India's first mission to the moon and subsequently for Mars mission also, there was a good amount of a collaboration as far as US is concerned. So under these circumstances where India's space program is heading, I think as far as India's space program is there is a good amount of a global cooperation which is being offered to India, and that's a good thing. When one tries to analyze the space program at the backdrop of a regional politics, say India, Pakistan, China politics, I think one has to look at this space program again from a different perspective. Let's accept the reality that all these three countries are nuclear weapon states. All these three countries have got very well developed missile programs. 2 of these countries have done already a SAT test also. So one has to understand at the backdrop of all these, how this space program is making progress. Particularly, I will say that vis-a-vis China, there is always an amount of a perception amongst many people that there is a good amount of a competition. But to my mind, I think China's space program is much more advanced program, and there is no charm for India unnecessarily to get into a competitive mode. Is there a collaboration? Definitely not in a big way, but there are certain indications after 2015 when both India and China joined hands together, and they have identified around 7 to 8 areas where they are trying to collaborate. There was a talk of a collaboration even for China's moon mission Chang'e 4, but it has not actually become possible due to certain reasons. But at least to a certain extent, there is a certain amount of a collaboration which is happening between India and China also. If you look at a global level, particularly at the level of multilateral collaborative organizations, there are two major organizations which are carrying the name of Asia Pacific. One is a regional organization, one is a collaborative organization. One of the organizations is being headed by China. Unfortunately, this organization, China, India and Japan are missing from this organization. Other organization is being headed by Japan, where India is there. But if you really look at it, the global players, as far as other players are concerned within the Asia Pacific region, most of the players are part of that organization. It's very obvious that most of these players are non-space faring nations, but one has to really understand that these are the countries which require a certain amount of assistance, certain amount of help to develop their own space programs, or at least to identify what these major countries in the region can do. So from that point of view, I think in Southeast Asia, or particularly in entire Asia per se, I can say, there is a certain amount of a collaborative arrangements which are happening. You look at few other international organizations which are coming up. One is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It has also got certain amount of agenda as far as talking against weaponization of a space are concerned. So you got India, Pakistan, and China, all three countries from the region are part of this. You look at a BRICS as an organization. This organization is trying to make inroads into various fields. Space was considered not a very decent area where the collaboration could emerge. But surprisingly, there is a certain amount of a collaboration which is emerging where all the countries in the BRICS organization are talking of a joint remote sensing program. So to my mind, certain amount of a collaboration is happening. So as far as Asia Pacific region is concerned, there are countries which are having certain amount of a collaborative and cooperative agenda. You look at India's taking positions at few other forums also. PPWT, which has been proposed by China and Russia, India is pretty constructive as far as these things are concerned. The view which has been proposed by India is that don't put the treaty into a dustbin, at least have a certain amount of a constructive debate on that treaty. I think these are the signs which are giving certain amount of indications that even though there is a certain amount of a competition which is for obvious reasons, certain amount of a collaboration is happening. So in nutshell, what I will say is that as far as the collaboration is concerned, whether into Asia Pacific region or globally also, one has to understand the reality that competition will exist, but one has to find a way out for doing more amount of a collaboration so that the relevance of a competition gets reduced. Other aspect which I would like to put into the table over here is that let's accept the fact that Russia and China are two major countries. They got major space programs. So isolating these countries are not going to help to bring a good atmosphere as far as outer space is concerned. This is where I rest my argument. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay. Eric, please.
Well, thank you, Dr. Robinson, for the chance to speak on this important topic. It's tough to be the last speaker of the day. I also have my undersecretary coming in, giving remarks first thing tomorrow morning, so I'm going to try to keep away from the points that she's going to make. So I'll start with a few perspectives from the State Department view of these issues. First, I'd like to compliment Dr. Robinson and her team on the comments they've had on the competition that's occurring. It's broader than just space warfare. The hybrid issue is becoming more difficult, and there's issues like that that we need to be thinking about because countries like China are attempting to create their own vision of the outer space environment. Now, I don't think any of us here likes the idea of an authoritarian country that oppresses its own people, that is using surveillance technology to oppress its own people, as being in the lead on creating new norms of responsible behavior in space. And I think we can certainly agree that it's better if we in this room are the ones leading as opposed to Russia and China. The United States has taken a leadership role in promoting the rule of law and in promoting the interests of the US, our allies, and partners in the domain that presents unique challenges in traditional international relations. As such, we believe it is in the interest of governments, private sector companies, and non-governmental organizations to seek the certainty of rules of the road based on best practices. And in these times of rapid innovation, we have to have a balance. Such guidelines should not be etched in stone, as with international treaties. Instead, we need to allow for the growth of new technologies and associated new policies. So how can we strengthen our international cooperation? John mentioned the National Defense Strategy as one example of where we're looking to focus our international cooperation. I'd like to note a few others that are in our policy. If you read our National Space Strategy, you will find that it provides clear guidance on working with allies and partners. It states the United States will, quote, foster conducive domestic and international environments where we will pursue bilateral and multilateral engagements to enable human space exploration, promote burden sharing, and marshal cooperative threat responses. And I think that marshaling cooperative threat responses is the important part there. I'd point out that our Space Force even talks about allies and partners as well. One priority there is ensuring unfederated use for United States national security purposes, the United States economy, the United States persons, partners, and allies. So it clearly calls out allies there. And another is deterring aggression and defending the nation, United States allies, and United States interests. So our focus will continue to be how can we work together to shape the international environment. To do this, we must engage in implementing existing space agreements and other international law in ways that support current and new space activities, including pursuing non-binding best practices and rules of behavior. Many of these practices can form the basis for voluntary, non-legally binding transparency and confidence-building measures, TCBMs, on both bilateral and multilateral bases. Some level of predictability and certainty is in everyone's interest. At the government-to-government level, much of this cooperation can be very practical. We've heard a lot about space traffic management here today. We also need to think about other ways of preventing collisions and the generating of long-lived debris. We also need to implement multilateral best practices. In these efforts, the United States is working closely with our G7 partners, as clearly articulated in the April 2019 G7 Foreign Minister statement, which endorsed, quote, the need to advance and develop norms of behavior in outer space and best practices for space operations, as well as to cooperate to prevent the creation and proliferation of long-lived orbital debris. Like-minded nations must also continue our work in the UN, especially at the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, to promote the implementation of 21 agreed guidelines on long-term sustainability. One of our colleagues mentioned the Conference on Disarmament. For those of you who follow UN matters, you are looking at the person who single-handedly ended the UN Group of Governmental Experts panel on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. Happy to answer questions on that if we want. We also need to figure out what our approach is going to be. The unfortunate demise in 2015 of the European Union's initiative to pursue an international code of conduct for space activities is instructive as to the challenges that we will face. Another example is the UN Conference on Disarmament, which has had a working group on space security, TCBMs, for 2 years now. However, that body has failed to make any substantial progress on space TCBMs, including in its most recent session in April of this year. There will be one more session in New York. Hopefully that session can make progress. If not there, then we need to give some thought to what other approaches and what other fora could be successful. We also need to think about how we want to shape the space environment. The concept paper for this conference notes an important fact. We have tolerated jamming and other hybrid actions. A fair question we need to consider is whether we need to reset this norm, and if so, how do we go about doing that? I think other areas of important trilateral cooperation in the future will be cybersecurity of our space systems. We have not discussed that a lot here, but how do we ensure that our commercial, our civil, and our national security systems are protected against cyber threats to space systems? And also, export controls. It's clear that countries like China still seek Western export technology, and if we really need to prevent them from developing these capabilities, we need to focus on our export controls. And finally, we need to figure out how we clearly communicate our intentions and expectations to our competitors. This is important in shaping the environment and preventing miscalculations. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and thank all the panelists for their introductory intervention. I will take advantage of my role as a moderator and will ask the first few questions. And what I would like to do is I will read them in advance so that the speakers have a little bit of time to think about them as I pose them. First question is to Regina. Without sounding self-serving, was your organization somewhat surprised by the systematic and aggressive pursuit of international space partnerships that we identified by these non-democratic space partners? For Eric, it just came to me now when you talked about export controls. We talked a lot about upgrading international space governance regime in this morning's session. What about penalties? And would it be helpful to communicate to likely irresponsible actors in advance? So that's one thought. Next question for John, but any of the panelists, please feel free to also react. I think addressing intent is the most difficult part in trying to address hybrid operations, certainly from a policy perspective. How could partnerships, in your mind, be helpful in this respect, such as bringing greater clarity to these attribution difficulties? And maybe for Ajay, I am actually interested in India's thinking about competition versus collaboration. You mentioned that you are trying to balance, India is trying to balance it, including with China. But what are your thoughts if, what would be the threshold from a policy perspective when India feels like it's losing its strategic position in the region? And I'm talking vis-a-vis regional partners or countries such as Sri Lanka and others, if you have any thoughts on that. Thank you. So Regina, if you're ready, please.
Thank you, Jana, for the question. So first of all, I encourage you to read the executive summary. It's an excellent piece of work based on, I think, over a year of research, of original research that you've done in tracking investments from different actors in different domains, and you've done a range of, you've identified a range of patterns and also case studies for us. So we're currently evaluating the findings, so it's too early to say whether we were surprised or not. Certainly we're intrigued by the identification of really the systematic patterns that we saw. I also don't want to sound self-serving, but from the SSA side, of course, I'm particularly interested in the ground segment and particularly activities that you've tracked for us in the high latitudes area. So that's particularly interesting. There's some great stuff in there. I think in general, for all of us, this type of work, and we have other reports from the Secure World Foundation and from CSIS on evidence-based, publicly available or grayly available data that we can use to really look beyond isolated incidents and synthesize and discern patterns so we can inform our own narratives or maybe tweak them or augment them. So I think this type of work is extremely important, especially because on a high level of abstraction in the space security debate, we often have a lot of rhetoric, so it's good to inform and corroborate what we have with really seeing patterns and narratives in that context. And so I guess we're currently still evaluating this, and I think whether we have to adjust some of our narratives or some of the perspectives that we have remains to be seen. But I think one aspect that I would suggest gives us all pause to think is one of the recommendations that you've highlighted, or the concluding remarks that you have in the executive summary, which is that if we as a community of trusted partners don't engage or enhance the different partnerships that we currently have, also with actors that are maybe counterintuitive in that sense, we risk, as you argue, that this space is being filled by other partners who do not necessarily share our interests and values in that regard.
Thank you, Regina. Eric?
If I could actually answer her question too, if you don't mind. I fully agree with all the points you made about that. It is difficult for us to match what the Chinese are doing in this arena. As you mentioned, the comprehensive nature of what they're offering. I'll say I wasn't surprised by the fact that they're doing this. I was surprised by the number, certainly. That's a lot. But I know that in the United States, we're trying to get out there and do what we can. First off, we're trying to get our own agreements with many countries to attract them to come and cooperate with us. Also, we're going out there and we're trying to highlight the risk of doing business with China. As you mentioned, the loan questions, the working for an authoritarian government, and what the risks are of your own data by having the Chinese in your systems. Especially noticeable in our discussions with foreign governments on the 5G question, which is equally as important. And then turning to the question about communicating in advance. That to me is very important, right? You don't want to wait until a crisis to then start suddenly communicating with your competitors. Conferences like this do help shape that because they're undoubtedly being aware of what's going on in these, and we'll see that we're out here talking trilaterally about how we can work to respond to competitors. But working together to communicate that is really essential. It's one thing for the United States to communicate that, but if we also have our allies in the European Union and in Japan also reiterating those messages, that sends a much stronger message for us. Thank you.
Thank you. John, any thoughts on the intent issue?
Yeah, I'd like to spend a few minutes just admiring the challenge that you asked. Intent is, to me, an intelligence problem. And our country went through a very difficult time after 9/11 when we tried to understand how we missed the signals. And it turns out that any hard intelligence problem, and things like intent is a hard intelligence problem, it's very difficult to have high confidence in your judgment. Okay, so intelligence is never black and white, it's shades of certainty. And after 9/11, President Bush created a doctrine of preemptive strike, which essentially meant we will act if we think something is going to happen. So as we think about the challenges of intent with regard to space, when the targets and the challenges are thousands of miles away, the first thing we need to do is have better capabilities to both know what's going on and to be able to determine exactly kind of what the capabilities are and things like that. But the second thing gets to really what I think this forum has talked about a bit today. It's establishing the norms of behavior. Right now, people can do things and we don't really know. We don't agree whether it's really bad or just a little bad. Those are things that really need to be developed and actually adopted globally so that we do have triggers that we can, I think, stand together on. And I would say, again, I'm just admiring the problem that you're asking. This is going to take a long time. It's hard work. It's never going to be clear and comfortable because you will never know exactly everything you want to know. But between the policies and capabilities, both of those have to advance if we're gonna get to a place where we're comfortable.
Thank you, John. Ajay.
I think I will pick up from what just now been mentioned about norms of behavior. It's very difficult to really get into the details of it. Like you had asked me that what could be the threshold for India as far as China's behavior is concerned. I think it's too early and too premature to make a statement on it because as it was rightly pointed out that US satellites were jammed temporarily, you know the cases of a keyhole series satellite getting jammed and all that. But one is not very sure that how you respond to all those things. So India also has got same sort of a dilemma as far as China is concerned. What you brought out very clearly, I think there's a very clear indication that China is trying to engage all the countries which are in the vicinity of India by giving them certain amount of assistance from space. In fact, long time back, it has been said that there is a certain amount of a string of pearls theory which China otherwise is supposed to operate into the high oceans is also operated in space vis-a-vis India. Because almost every country which is surrounding India has been engaged by China. And the best example is Sri Lanka, what you have brought out. But other countries also, even Nepal, Bangladesh, their satellites have been also launched by China. So China is doing it in a very systematic fashion. As far as Pakistan is concerned, China is giving them military access to Baidu systems. Their entire space program is dependent, or Pakistan's entire space program is dependent on Chinese assistance. So India is understanding all these compulsions. But India has to live with its neighbors, so India has to find a way out. One of the way outs which has been thought of is that the way China is making investments into Belt and Road Initiative, particularly into the space domain. This is one arena which has not been much talked of. You got a digital BRI and a space BRI, which is going on, and China is doing huge amount of investments. But there is a school of thought that China will not be able to sustain so much amount of investments. Like countries like Sri Lanka are already facing the problems vis-a-vis the Chinese investments which have been made and the returns which they are asking. Smaller countries like Sierra Leone has already got out of the BRI project because they are thinking that you can't match Chinese expectations just because they are investing money into it. So there is a feel of thought that China's model is not sustainable as far as making huge amount of investments from a space perspective into all these countries. India came out with a model of engaging neighbors with the idea of a SARC satellite, which eventually, because Pakistan never agreed, happened to be a South Asia satellite. So that's the way India is trying to engage the neighboring countries. This is, I think, cat and mouse is not a very correct name, but that's the game which has been played on right now. One has to live through both. That's the reason I'm saying both competition as well as collaboration has to go on.
I think you made an excellent point concerning the potential unsustainability of some of these arrangements by, let's say, China, and perhaps in some cases also in Russia. But perhaps a comment that if I just may is that in the meantime, before the countries realize that some of these arrangements might be problematic for them, is that, China and Russia make an important leeway into the countries vis-a-vis, their hardware in exchange for some political software. So we think, from our perspective, that the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years will be really important in increasing our initiatives with regard to how we can offer partnerships in a sustainable way. But just a comment on what you just said, please.
What you say is exactly the point. China is making investments. They also know that those countries will not be able to manage it from a financial perspective. So whenever the process of a norms building and other aspects at the level of the United Nations is going to come up, China is definitely going to ask those countries to side with them. And that's basically what one has to understand, that it is a very larger game which they are playing over here.
Thank you, Ajay. We have about half an hour, and I would like to take that opportunity to open the floor for any questions that you might have. So we'll start here, and we'll move over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Alexandru Georgescu. I'm from Romania, from the National Institute for Research and Development in Informatics. Based on the discussion so far, what strikes me is that only the actors who have full or partial spectrum capabilities for space actually have any agency in these sorts of partnerships and discussions. There are also actors who do not have these capabilities, and the relationship, the partnerships are just one way. We talk about China, Russia, and their partners, but it could also be here. And my question to the panel would be how to create, how to make countries such as Romania, Bulgaria, and so on, and Poland into assets in the partnerships we are creating in order for the relationship to not be one way, because from our perspective, even though the most developed countries, they have the largest exposure to space based on unit of GDP or overall economy size, at the same time, our countries, the ones without space capabilities, they have every exposure to a space risk that the other countries have, plus one extra, which is the political risk of not having their own satellite systems. And this explains part of the philosophy behind how Galileo and Copernicus, the terms of use were made. So how do you see this issue? How do you see the development of a two-way relationship between the big space actors and the smaller ones? Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think actually it's already maybe not a completely reciprocal two-way street. I can't comment, but I mean, for instance, my colleague Pascal Fauché mentioned earlier the European Space Surveillance and Tracking Support Framework. Romania, Poland, and Portugal just joined. And if I stay on the kind of ground segment line, we have a huge number of actors, private and public, state and non-state actors that have carved out really valid and successful niches, or beginning to carve them out in the ground segment. And they are not necessarily partners that operate space assets. So they do, it's true, not have a primary interest in safeguarding and maneuverable assets in orbit because they don't have them. However, they have really valid cases based on regional, geographical locations, certain types of capabilities or resources that are really interesting to other space powers, and that are actually being integrated and make a really, let's say, strong contribution in that regard. So I think we need to understand that. I think, I don't know if it was Jamie who brought it up this morning in the Cold War. Of course, we had this full spectrum capability for the main space powers during the Cold War, and it was much more clear-cut, the kind of interests and rationales that would inform this kind of capability. But right now, you have a huge diversification of interests. And it's true that these interests don't necessarily they're shared goals, perhaps, but they're not necessarily the same interests that lead to that goal. But I think in response to your point, there's actually a huge amount of activity underway to mitigate or to, it's a kind of entropy or equilibrium that's already occurring, especially in the ground segment, because to operate successfully in the ground segment, you do not need space asset necessarily. You just need to offer something valuable and bring this to the table to those who operate.
I think you had asked excellent questions. The issue of a space haves and space have-nots is going to come up. But one must understand, as a space have-not, that there are, say, 10 to 11 countries which are having a space capability, so-called. But when United Nations is concerned, all those countries have got one vote, and other countries also have got one vote. So when it comes to the discussions and arms control and disarmament, I think all these countries which have space have-nots have got a greater responsibility to play a major role. The other thing is that these countries need to understand that they have to get into the software or a policy aspects of these things. There are 2 to 3 countries which often come to my mind. One is Luxembourg, other is UAE, and third is Singapore. These countries have understood that they will not be having a rocket launching capability, but they are trying to look at the issue of a space from a different perspective, and they are also making their importance felt into the game. So the other countries also need to make it sure that they are also becoming important, may not be as a spacefaring state, but otherwise from an economic and a business perspective point of view.
Thank you. Any other comments? There you go.
Just to agree with what Regina said, I thought her comments were right on. Our Czech colleagues commented about how they were proud to have an astronaut. Of course, Romania has one as well, so you've already got some of that basis already in Romania. I think The big issue is that this is going to grow organically over time. The entrance requirements to get something into space is getting lower and lower all the time. You know, universities, individuals are putting things into space, and so I think we're going to see more and more countries having space capabilities. I think the Israeli payload to the moon was a great example of something that they did on a NGO industry capacity that really inspired a lot of people around the world, and I think we're going to see more and more of that as time goes on.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I would just say I think your comment aligned with exactly the point I made about our leadership, encouraging developing partnerships not based on some quid pro quo, but just like the country that sent a cook to stand with us. We are developing relationships that are not equal and balanced. We have SSA sharing relationships with countries that don't have space programs. So we're taking the long view on this. It's not about equality. It's really about building a coalition and really moving the broader policy issues forward.
We'll have Cassandra, please.
Hi, Cassandra Steer from Women in International Security and Space Strategies Consulting. Actually, my question is pretty much the same as the previous question, except that I had in my mind a much more controversial and perhaps inflammatory way of posing the question, which is if we're talking about space sector capture, perhaps it's a little easy for us to say, well, what we're doing and what the US is doing is all really great partnership building because we are democratic. And that as soon as it's a non-democratic state entering into those kind of partnerships, we have to be suspicious of why they're doing that, the interests and the effects. The more controversial aspect of what I was going to ask, I guess, is don't we need to be more nuanced? Isn't there a kind of space sector capture going on from the current space powers? And I would also suggest, with all due respect to the American colleagues here, that perhaps the US is not the greatest example of a functioning democracy today. So if we have an unpredictable head of state, we have statements about undoing what judges, the role of judges or the media, one statement from the head of state that competes with what's coming out of the Department of Defense or other departments. And to take an example from a different area, in international criminal law, the US was very, very instrumental in creating the International Criminal Court, and then decided at the last minute to withdraw its participation, and has since gone around making, well, in the period in the 2000s, making all sorts of bilateral arrangements with countries based on its political interests at the time, saying, do not take part in this regime. If you ever have US nationals in your jurisdiction, please send them back to the US and never send them to the International Criminal Court. So it's not in the space sector, but in the space sector, the US, Australia, and Canada and other allies actually, one could say, blockaded the code of conduct process because of their political interests at that time. So even though these are democratic nations, and even though we would hope that the kind of partnerships that are being built, you gave the example just now that they're not always equal. Sometimes there's data sharing to the benefit of these non-spacefaring states. I just wonder if we need to nuance a little bit this idea of space sector capture with, again, apologies if that is perhaps too inflammatory.
Thank you. Who would like to react?
I'm going to stay away from some of the more inflammatory remarks you just made. But I want to say, I disagree a little bit. NASA remains a huge, amazing, inspiring entity of the US government. I go around internationally and I'm just shocked the number of NASA t-shirts, most of them probably illegally manufactured, not licensed by NASA, but it just shows, NASA continues to inspire people to do outer space activities. We've got the Apollo 11 50th anniversary coming up. This is an opportunity for our countries to continue to inspire, and that's where we're looking more broadly Apollo 11, very much a US-focused activity. That's why when we talk about our next generation of activities, we're talking about partnering with other countries so that we can continue to inspire as we continue to explore the universe. And so I hope that we'll still be able to present a model of better cooperation where there's not so many financial problems or data problems or things like that that these other countries are going to start to see in their dealings with countries like China. Thank you.
Maybe offer one more comment. I mean, in principle, I agree with you on the idea of being nuanced, and I think that was also the rationale for us to engage in this type of work, to really have an evidence based on where we can also deduct ourselves certain kinds of narratives and patterns that we see. So it's really important to have these nuances, is right. And of course, we see historically that if we look at how space capabilities came to Europe, or I'm not going to talk about Operation Paperclip and how everything migrated, but since you just mentioned NASA, Eric, I mean, pretty much the entire ground segment, mission control, tracking facilities, much of these capabilities in Europe hail from the Apollo program, and having scientists trained up by the Apollo program by NASA in Spain, for instance, to develop tracking. And of course, on the other side of the Iron Curtain in the Warsaw Pact states, you had the same kind of, let's say, capturing or at least partnerships in the Intercosmos program, which is why you have Romanian and Czech and German cosmonauts from the east side. So I think it's true that there are developments going on both sides, and I think having this type of research, I think for us it's really important to discern these nuances that we need to then inform our own narratives with, however you want to frame them.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
I entirely agree with your point, but there are 2-3 issues. I totally agree about the image of a NASA. Even China is very keen to engage NASA. Technically, they are not permitted, but there is a talk that there could be certain amount of a collaboration happening between NASA and China also. So one has to look at these things from 2 to 3 different perspectives. One is that, one way to look at it is that space race was very important because the budgets were coming. If my memory goes correct, US federal budget used to be 4.2% of something when the Apollo mission was on. Now today it is 0.5%. So the money is not there. So today, if you really build up the collaboration, you need to look at projects which are economically viable. What is happening is that you are talking of a collaboration in deep space, say Lagrangian point going there and all that. These things are not going to become economically viable. So if you want to engage the have-nots, you need to come out with the programs which are economically viable. And I think at the end of the day, it's economics which will drive the entire focus. And that may bring more amount of a collaboration.
Thank you, Ajay. Victoria? Yeah.
Victoria Sampson, Secure World Foundation. I have 2 questions. One, this panel has focused mostly on international partnerships in terms of government to government. And I'd be curious to know where the commercial sector fits into some of this conversation, given that space will become almost overwhelmingly commercial in the next few years. And then my second question is for Eric. We're among friends here. Let's hear about your experience with the GG in Paris. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Any takers for the first part of the question?
As far as collaboration with industries or at a non-governmental level, I think it's too early because there are only 2 to 3 industries which are doing a great business, say Virgin or SpaceX or other things. Other organizations, you have visited India many times, you know it far better. You got startups which are just coming up. So to have an industry level collaboration, you need to have something that those startups should offer to the major players that, oh, this is some innovation which has happened. Then only the collaboration will happen. Otherwise, I think it's too early to have a industry level, industry to industry collaboration. B2B partnership, it's too early, I think, in space domain.
Yeah, I think, I mean, coming from this European perspective on industry, I mean, in our case, it's really that of course, we have industry at different parts of the value chain to manufacture assets, to provide certain types of services. But for instance, in the SSA area, we currently have a market for MEO-GEO, because optical investment is relatively low. But of course, on other sides, if someone were to invest a large amount into LEO radar, then I think this is a really interesting source of data, for instance, in the SSA domain. On the other hand, and that's of course companies that, Exo Analytics, for instance, in the UK, but we have, of course, a huge industry in the States to inform SSA, other parts of the ground segment. In Europe, so the market at the moment kind of is still very much depending on public money. So there's still, there's no market from the companies. Currently, we provide services for free, for instance, for EOSST. There's other companies that are already offering some commercial services, but it's not a hugely consolidated market yet. So right now it's public money, so I think this is going to probably stay for the next few years. And I think if we want to build good partnerships with industry, which we should, it's really necessary to have everyone part of the conversation, which is currently not the case because everyone's scrambling for roles and interests and lobbying at various forms. So if we want to build something together, then we really have to talk to each other, which we currently in Europe not necessarily doing, frankly.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add a little bit to that. I would say that I see evidence both in our executive branch and legislative branch that are prioritizing investing in the commercial sector really everywhere we can. And in fact, I would caution people that are essentially talking about markets that don't exist yet, but there's a lot of hype and promise. And I think, quite frankly, in some of those areas, we need to be careful to make sure that they grow in a healthy way. And there's a lot of questions over, will they all work out? And certainly they won't all. But there's I think, more interest right now than proof that the commercial markets are going to actually develop in certain sectors.
Thank you. Agnieszka had a question.
Okay.
My apologies.
Actually, that was probably better. So commercial. Last year, the U.S. State Department spent $150,000 on space activities. So commercial entities are not running to the State Department to talk to us about their new projects or seek funding from us. But I think as Peter talked about, issues like confers are going to be very important where we get commercial buy-in in the future. Commercial is going to lead the way. And in fact, government is going to have a hard time reacting to a lot of the developments in the commercial industry. Now on the UN group of governmental experts on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. For those of you who are not huge followers of the United Nations, every year in October, the United Nations focuses on disarmament issues. Space is a major issue in there. And since the 1980s, around the time of President Reagan's speech on Star Wars, the Russians have proposed a discussion on the prevention of an arms race in outer space, mostly to flog their treaty that would prevent the placement of weapons in outer space. So in 2017, they had a UN resolution passed to create a panel of experts from 25 countries to review what the next steps should be on a legally binding treaty on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. The United States and some of our allies either voted no on this resolution or abstained, but because it's a majority, simple majority rule in the UN system, the group was passed. So we met for 2 weeks, once in August 2018 and then in March of 2019 in Geneva to negotiate a document on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And so first of all, I want to thank our European and Asian allies, especially Japan. We coordinated very well on our position going into this negotiation. There was a broad agreement that the Russian treaty that was designed to prevent the placement of weapons in outer space neglected all of the ground-based systems that they're developing. And so we spent the 25 weeks, the 4 weeks with 25 experts pointing out the flaws in the Russian document. And that was really effective with many of the other countries in the room. I think that we did a very good job of convincing them that the Russian treaty was not the way forward. However, in the end, this was not something that the United States voted for in the first place. And the final document was too much like an actual treaty. It started with a preamble that you would have in an actual treaty and then listed important elements of an actual treaty. And despite our efforts to try to negotiate something that looked less like a treaty, we were unable to reach agreement on the final document. And so the big question for us now is, what do we take forward? What do we as allies think is our approach to this issue? The Russians and the Chinese right now dominate that space with this treaty. We don't have an alternative that we can get countries to vote yes for, and it's something that we're going to be very focused on as we try to move forward and figure out what our next steps as a community are. Thank you.
Thank you, and I apologize again for forgetting the second part of the question.
Hello, Agnieszka Łukaszczyk from Planet. I am actually very surprised by the answers of the panelists in regards to the involvement of industry in these matters and saying that maybe it's not the right time yet. I think the time has been, we're already late. I mean, when you look at mega constellations, which there's a lot of them, ours being the biggest one so far, that can cause a lot of damage potentially and produce a lot of risk. I'm surprised that they're actually not at a table, that we're not at a table. Planet right now has the largest constellation in history in space. So it's not a startup and it's not a trivial actor. And Starlink has just launched many satellites, OneWeb and Spire, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think space operators should be neglected as actors and members of the discussion. And as a good example of that is actually Space Data Association that was actually started by private operators, commercial operators, because they thought governments were way too slow to offer any sort of protection for the operators and to make sure that the collision avoidance is in place. And they've done such a good job that actually then public institutions followed those, right? So actually DLR is a member, NOAA is a member, NASA is a member, but that was actually driven by the commercial sector. So there are some serious steps that are being taken by the commercial sector, and I think it would not hurt to listen to them on a regular basis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me say, I hope that everybody is wildly successful. It would help the US government do its mission. I would just say my comments, I could point to a number of areas like launch, remote sensing in the US has been typically really government funded for where we've been engaging, and Planet is a rare exception to the successful commercial markets. And I actually point to Planet as a very interesting model. Some of the most interesting things going on are the result of almost single, very wealthy individuals as opposed to a broader market. Now again, I am very hopeful that all of that continues. But the last thing I would say is in the areas where investments are being made, the actual markets are there's only a couple. Communications is one, launch is one, a little of the remote sensing. But many of the other things are not what I would call real commercial markets that we do, although people are exploring doing them. Weather, GPS. You know, so there's a few other in the security areas that we don't see any investment going on. So people talk about these revolution, the explosion of commercial. I worry that, for example, in the launch area, we went through this about 15 or 20 years ago when people thought that the market was going to explode. It didn't. Today in launch, there are more countries getting into the business, and it's not clear yet whether that market is going to materialize. So the comment was really a larger one, but I really hope that it is successful, because we all will benefit from that.
Yeah, I think Space Data Association is a great example. This was actually one of the 2 points of collaborating while you compete that I mentioned earlier when I made my introductory remarks. And you're right that this has been going on for some time, and of course it's a really successful model in sharing ephemeris for collision avoidance. However, the data that we primarily rely on in Europe at this point in time for collision avoidance in an operational context is of course still based on US data, on sensors, and we have a number of actors in Europe that have been developing sensor assets, especially for SSA and tracking for decades. So France has a huge legacy, Germany has an old huge tracking sensor and it's coming online with new systems. So I think it's really important that we are able to combine both, and some of the members of the Space Data Association are indeed customers or users of, for instance, the European SST service that we currently have. So I think that's really good. But you're absolutely right. Everyone needs to be on the table, and I think that's my personal impression. What I currently see from some industry actors, that's currently not the case in Europe. There's a lot of channeling towards and advocacy, but no real systematic dialogue.
I think the question which was asked was about business versus business model. That means, will one industry engage other industry? So in that response, I was of the opinion that industry to industry collaboration at this point in time may not be feasible. Number one, there is huge amount of differences about the capabilities of one industry and other industry. And other aspect is that if you look at the international collaboration, almost every industry in any country is supported by their main space program. That means NASA is asking their industry to do XYZ. Similarly, in India, ISRO is asking their industry to do XYZ. So a company in US cannot collaborate with company in India to do a program for ISRO. ITAR could be an issue. There could be a lot amount of issues. So one has to look at it that in isolation, industry is doing well. But when it comes to global collaboration, when there are two countries collaborating, can two industries from two different countries collaborate? I think that's too early.
Thank you, Ajay. So I think we have one last question from the back, and
Thank you. My name is Andrea Capurso, European GNSS Agency. I have a bit of a broad question. Our distinguished US panelists mentioned the efforts put in place on TCBMs and guidelines, and these seem to be the trend for space law and policy lately. But there was another interesting point that was raised in one of the previous panels about the time in the 60s where there was a very hot competition, but in response to that competition and as a response to the changing technology, that competition brought compromise, and that compromise was the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and 50 years later we still rely on that compromise. Now my question is, what is missing in today's international stage to give new life to the treaty-making process with regard to space? To be more precise, wouldn't it be beneficial for the EU and the US to lead that process of tackling those differences and finding the new compromise? Thank you.
thank you for the question.
Everybody's staring at me. There's a couple things I think that are missing. You know, I'll lump the Limited Test Ban Treaty in there as well as the Outer Space Treaty. There were issues of common interest between the countries at the time. With the Limited Test Ban Treaty, not testing nuclear weapons in orbit made sense as we were thinking about human spaceflight and the damages it could have done to the space environment in the pursuit of those activities. Again, for the Outer Space Treaty, it was very clear that neither country had a desire to place weapons of mass destruction in orbit. A little known fact is that when the United States conducted our ratification of the treaty is that we felt the treaty was verifiable. We felt that through our national technical means, we could verify whether the Soviet Union at the time had placed a weapon of mass destruction in orbit. In our opinion, it was also not militarily relevant to place a weapon of mass destruction in orbit when you could deliver something by a ballistic missile in 30 minutes, and if you had something in orbit, it might maybe come around in the next 90 minutes or so. So we felt that the treaty at the time was something that we could achieve. So what is missing now? First, partners we trust. That's a very easy one. I think it's clear the US position that we don't feel that Russia is complying with many of the arms control treaties that are in existence today. We've made a major point on the Intermediate Nuclear Range Forces Treaty. We think they're in violation of that. We disagree with their treaty on the placement of weapons in outer space because we have concerns about what they're going to be placing in outer space. We don't believe that they will meet the commitments of that treaty. Second, I think the other thing that's missing is a common understanding. We had a common understanding that nuclear weapons in space was not something either country was going to do. I think at this time we're still trying to figure out what those common understandings are. And so until we have some of those in place, I think we're going to be focused on the easier, as I think Doug, I think it was your point, the low-hanging fruit, which may be the TCBMs and norms, things that we can get done quickly, rather than relying on a long, protracted negotiating process.
Well, on this positive note, semi-positive note, I would like to conclude the panel. So please give a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much for being here. And before you rise, please hear some logistic information. I would just like to note that for those that will be joining us for the gala dinner this evening, I would like to mention that there are buses that will take you to the dinner venue, and they leave from the Savoy Hotel and from the Lindner Hotel at 18:45 or 6:45 p.m. So please be at the lobby in time, because it's time of traffic in Prague at that time. And also, you know, if others that stay in the other hotels would like to take the bus, please come to those two hotels, Savoy or Lindner. If you would like to take a walking tour to the gala dinner, we will have someone to accompany you. So for those who would like to walk, please be at the Savoy Hotel at 18:30 or 6:30 p.m. Also, last note, for those who we arrange airport transfers for, please talk to Boris, if you haven't yet, concerning your departure time to the airport from the ministry or from your hotel. But generally, it's 2 hours prior to the departure, but he will give you any further details on that. So with this, thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening in sunny Prague. So, thank you.